see, the problem with an incomplete manga is that the fan base is left with a litany of questions. What will happen to the MC? Will they marry their love interest? Will they defeat the bad guy? Will the kingdom find peace? And thousands of other questions following this same line of logic. Because when a story doesn't get its ending, unfortunately, the fans of that story have to find the ending themselves. But those are just the kind of questions that an average fan base asks when their story either slows down in its releasal or stops in its entirety. But those questions pale in comparison to the questions that the Hunter x Hunter fandom has been plagued with for the last couple of years. Because Hunter x Hunter is not only just on a hiatus, but a hiatus that is taking place before one of the largest and craziest undertakings in manga arc history. You see, Togashi, the mangaka of Hunter x Hunter, rather unwisely, as he was aware of his health condition, decided to not end the Hunter x Hunter manga after Gon met his father, like he very easily could have. And now I know a lot of you are saying, but Nick, if he ended the manga when Gon met his father, there would be so many lingering questions. And of course, there would be. Because the way that Togashi set up Hunter x Hunter prior to Gon meeting his father planted multiple seeds in the story that weren't meant to pay off until we got at least to the Dark Continent. But at least back then, they were just seeds. Nobody had watered them, there was no manure in the soil, and so while we would still have lingering questions, they wouldn't be awful. And technically, the continuation of the story after Gon meets his father initially was just Hisoka versus Chrollo in the Heavens Arena, which one could say could also be the ending to the story, as one of the biggest things that's waved in front of our face throughout the entirety of Hunter x Hunter's manga or anime is just how badly Hisoka wants to battle against Chrollo, and therefore the bow to the present that was Hunter x Hunter could have been this battle. Because by the end of this battle, we could truly see which of these two Phantom Troop members was the strongest. And just like that, Killua gets a friend, Gon gets a father, Hisoka fights Chrollo, and the story comes to a close. But slowly and surely, after Hisoka and Chrollo's battle came to an end, Togashi began to build his way towards what would be his longest, largest, and most ambitious arc ever. Because Togashi, for years, had been playing with the concept of the Dark Continent, a landmass that takes up the majority of the Hunter x Hunter world, a place of intense danger where only 0.04% of the humans that have ever stepped place on it that have left the V5 countries have survived. But to tell the story of the Dark Continent would take hundreds of chapters. It would nearly double the runtime of Hunter x Hunter as a manga, and yet Togashi, with his failing health, decided, you know what? Let's tell that story. And now, as a fan base, we are stuck on a boat to the Dark Continent. Because Togashi, being Togashi, couldn't just have a boat go to the Dark Continent. Don't be silly. He has to build out a complex political thriller story about a newly founded country trying to find the succession to their royal family. All while the Phantom Troop battles against a bunch of magical gangsters who are empowered by their new imaginary Nen beasts. And oh yeah, Hisoka's on the boat. And thus, because the story didn't conclude when the anime concluded, fandom is left with more questions than we ever dreamed imaginable. And a mangaka that recently released a fourth favorite ending onto Twitter and all other social media as the official ending of Hunter x Hunter in case he dies before he finishes the story. So that's what we get. Thousands of questions and Togashi's fourth favorite ending. And while Togashi isn't even 60 yet, he has been working on Hunter x Hunter for 26 whole years. Which, if you guys aren't great at math, means that if he released a chapter every single week over the course of the last 26 years, we would be sitting at a pretty ripe little number of 1,352 chapters. Yet, here we are. 400, which means over the course of the last 26 years, Togashi has been releasing a new chapter of Hunter x Hunter every 3.5-ish weeks. But recent years really skew those numbers, and thus it looks like every single week that we don't get a new Hunter x Hunter chapter, that the questions that we have lingering about this story will truly never be answered. That doesn't stop us from asking those lingering questions, specifically as those lingering questions pertain to the Dark Continent itself. We ask questions like, why is it so dangerous? What's the real story behind the 5 calamities? Why is there existing structures of the Dark Continent? What is Dawn Freaks doing there? And so many others. But really, when you boil down all of these questions down to their key components, we're left with one lingering question. Did humans come from the Dark Continent? And if they did, why did they leave? Well, we're gonna be answering that question and a whole lot more today, guys, because today we're talking the Dark Continent's craziest secret revealed. But before we get to revealing anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you like the idea of me revealing things about your favorite anime and manga, then you're gonna love my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. Available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Or if you're not a person who likes to reveal themselves to the grander public, then you're gonna love my merch store, otakusanonymous.net, where you can pick up some of the greatest anime t-shirts, sweatshirts, sticker packs known to man. There is so much lore in the Hunter x Hunter universe. So much lore that sometimes it's hard to keep up with. Togashi's writing style packs so much information into so little time that some of our less literate manga readers have decided to put down Togashi's famous manga because it's got too much text. But because of this, Togashi in the 400 chapters of Hunter x Hunter has managed to convey as much information about his universe as stories with double the runtime as his, like Naruto or One Piece. Yeah, I'm aware of how much information is in One Piece, but trust me, if you read the Hunter x Hunter manga, you'll understand there's a comparable amount of information in Hunter x Hunter. But amongst all the rules and stipulations that are too many to count, and thus people forget, there is one rule that everybody who's at least tangentially familiar with Hunter x Hunter's story will be able to tell you. That is that the V5 countries keep the existence of Nen a secret. In fact, hunters are really the only people on Earth who ever get to learn about its existence, as the second phase of the Hunter is about discovering Nen and mastering it. But when it comes down to it, this isn't the only worldwide secret that the V5 countries are hiding from their civilians, as the mere existence of the Dark Continent is also shrouded in a ton of mystery, as to make sure that none of the general public are ever enticed to try to make a journey to the Dark Continent. And thus, just like with Nen, the only people who really know about the Dark Continent are hunters and world leaders. Why would humanity try to keep these two very specific yet very important aspects of life a mystery from the general public? Well, possibly because Nen is the very reason that humanity had to flee from the Dark Continent in the first place. See, I was sent a theory over email that asked the question, what if the reason that humanity decided to leave the Dark Continent is because everybody on the Dark Continent knew Nen, and therefore the reason that humanity had to flee to the islands in the Mobius Lake wasn't because the Dark Continent was dangerous, but because humanity made it dangerous. See, we all know, maybe it's actually a pretty nuanced piece of information, that there's been 149 unofficial expeditions to the Dark Continent. However, only 5 of those expeditions have ever gone to the Dark Continent and returned with any kind of survivors. And only 3 members from those 5 expeditions have ever passed a sanity test upon returning to the V5 countries that allowed them to re-enter society, which means out of 149 journeys to the Dark Continent, there are only 3 people who survived and retained their sanity. 2 of those people are Isaac and Beyond Netero. As for who the third person is, we don't know if it's Zig Zoldyck or Lean, or Linne. It's L-I-N-N-E. How would you say that? Linne. Goddamn French people. By the way, I'm gonna be in Paris in 3 weeks, so I'll finally get to see whether or not French people are, in fact, real or not. But the craziest part about the aspect that only 3 people returned with their sanity intact from the Dark Continent, and the 0.04% survival rate, is the fact that on every single one of these 5 official journeys, 1 from each of the V5 countries, the V5 countries only sent either the strongest humans they had to offer, or some of the highest level hunters and Nen users that they had around. And thus that meant that the foes that they ran into on the Dark Continent were stronger than even the strongest humans and hunters that humanity had to offer. And by and large, we already know the names of these foes and how they killed these strongest humans. Then that's because the 5 expeditions that went to the Dark Continent and returned all came back with a separate one of the 5 threats or 5 calamities. And by and large, at least according to the accounts of the survivors from these 5 expeditions, 5 individual calamities that they brought back with them were the calamities responsible for killing the majority of the people who went on the expedition. But what's weird about these 5 calamities is that 4 of them either work parasitically on humans or have a humanoid shape. With the only exception to this rule being the Hellbell, a twin-headed snake. But why would these calamities, which have presumably never seen humans, be so adapted to either look like humans or to feast on them parasitically? Well, that's because, more likely than not, humans originated on the Dark Continent, and because the entirety of humanity was allowed to adapt to Nen, the landmass eventually became too dangerous for humanity's continued existence. See, this theory dictates that the only reason that life is sustainable on the V5 countries is because 99.99% of people don't have access to Nen. And anybody who does want to gain access to Nen has to pass the Hunter exam, which makes sure that only the emotionally and physically strong will ever gain access to Nan, as the hunter exam is made specifically to be incredibly grueling, so that truly only the cream of the crop of humanity will gain access to a hunter's license and the opportunity to learn Nen. And this is all thanks to the Hunters Association, a governing body that supersedes the government of basically every other country within the Mobius Lake, as hunters by and large are granted some form of diplomatic immunity, where so long as the Hunter Association says that they need hunters to go somewhere, hunters are allowed to go to that place. And thus, if you think about it, the hunter exam is a test set up by the greatest governing body in the entirety of the V5 countries to see who is genuinely worthy of ever getting the opportunity to learn Nen, which is the greatest power on Earth. But this theory further dictates that when humanity lived on the Dark Continent, knowledge of Nen was spread far and wide. Anybody willing to have their Nen nodes forcibly opened could have a chance at learning Nen. And while obviously this could possibly lead to people exhausting the entirety of their Nen and dying, a vast majority of humanity was able to gain access to Nen, and thus humanity as a whole was overflowing with it. But this became a problem, much in the same way that cursed energy is a problem in JJK, because Nen can become a deadly tool in the hands of the wrong people, and it can become an even deadlier tool in the hands of a dead person. See, the cursed energy system in JJK is, let's say, entirely inspired by Nen, which is why there's so much power in cursing somebody's death in JJK. It's how Yuta was able to get his hands on Rika, and we learned from Hisoka after his battle against Crollo and Pito after his battle against Gon just how powerful post-death Nen can be. And thus there is a possibility that the 5 calamities that return from the Dark Continent to the V5 countries after the 5 official expeditions, while being exactly that 5 calamities, could also be dead Nen users who cursed their death and came back as a calamity of sorts. And thus as this kind of thing continued to happen, as Nen users died and cursed their death, becoming calamities that wreaked havoc over the Dark Continent began to slowly but surely become overrun by these terrifying threats, who after their death lost all semblance of humanity and were now referred to as Nen beasts. And it's a possibility that the introduction of the spiritual Nen beasts of the Kakyun family, the royal family on the Black Whale, is a way for Togashi to show us just how powerful a Nen beast, even when manifested by somebody who can't use Nen, can become, as very few of the princes currently embroiled in the royal succession contest had Nen before the contest. And thus if you scale problems like that out to an entire world, where one king with a pot that you drip a little blood into is able to manifest imaginary Nen beasts for all of his children that are capable of doing things like rewriting the future, then the combination of those kinds of Nen beasts with people awakening Nen left, right, and center who will eventually die and use post-mortem Nen to keep their bodies around could definitely create an environment in which you wouldn't want to live in. And therefore unchecked Nen usage like this led to the downfall of an entire globe, which would leave the surviving masses of that globe to flee to Lake Mobius, and specifically flee to the archipelago of islands that are now the V6 countries. And when the surviving masses made it to these new islands, separated from now what they called the Dark Continent, they made a pact or an agreement to form a governing body known as the Hunters Association that would monitor and limit the usage of Nen in the human society, making sure that only the truly powerful would ever inherit Nen. And therefore, with only a small fraction of the population ever learning Nen, they would never run the chance of some small nobody accidentally manifesting enough post-mortem Nen to create an entity that would be able to kill high-level hunters. And this theory is backed up by the manga, which stated that by deciphering the runes and myths of an ancient society, we were able to decipher the fact that humanity came from the Dark Continent. And while that's not necessarily a confirmation, the fact that we were told that by deciphering runes of ancient society seems to imply that humanity came from the Dark Continent is enough of a hint for us to say, oh yeah, okay, that's probably where humanity came from. This theory is also backed up by the fact that there is existing structures on the Dark Continent, as one of the expeditions that went to the Dark Continent that went to the north side stumbled upon a labyrinth city where they found the Bryon. And not much is known about the Bryon outside of the fact that it's classified as the botanical weapon, but the Bryon does have a humanoid body with a sphere where its head should be. And thus a city that looks as though it was built by human hands is occupied by one one of the humanoid threats. That's a weird correlation. And in an expedition that went to the south of Lake Mobius, they found a giant gate. And this gate was surrounded by the Eye, a gaseous life form that's clearly able to take over people's bodies, as Aluka is taken over by Eye to create Nanika. And thus, in another place where a clearly human structure was created, there is one of the 5 threats that operates parasitically with humans, meaning that it's been exposed to humans in the past. So in both the north and the south, we have both human structures and threats that are either humanoids themselves or need humans to survive. On top of this, chimera ants were said to have clearly originated from the Dark Continent. And while it's never stated how the chimera ants got to the V6 countries, as they weren't listed as one of the 5 threats, this doesn't mean that the chimera ants were anything less than an absolute world-eating menace. On top of this, chimera ants have also shown that they very much have the ability to adapt into humanoids with the capability of high-level speech and thought. And therefore, there's also the possibility that humanity that was overflowing with Nen on the Dark Continent was also driven off the Dark Continent by the existence of multiple ant kings. See, because here's the thing. If we think about what Meruem wanted to eat more than anything, it was the brains of Nen users. And by consuming the brains of these Nen users, Meruem, as an ant king, was able to synthesize their abilities. And thus, if you take a human society that's overflowing with Nen, that's living alongside chimera ants, it makes sense that not only would multiple different ant tribes pop up, but also that any high-level chimera ant would be able to feast on Nen users. And the same would go doubly true for a chimera ant king. And thus, on the Dark Continent, you would have the same problem that you had in East Gorteau times 100, if not 1,000. On top of this, there exists on the outskirts of Lake Mobius a group of magical beasts known as the Gatekeepers, who we've never seen, who have the ability to summon something known as the Guide that we also have never seen. And this guide has been essential for every journey that actually did make it to the Dark Continent and made it back, as without the guide, it's impossible to get beyond the oceanic forces of Lake Mobius. But why would humanity set up this kind of relationship? And more importantly, when would humanity set up this kind of relationship? How would they be aware of the Gatekeepers' presence? And more importantly, why would the Gatekeepers help humanity? Unless, of course, the Gatekeepers are a look into humanity's past, a more magical version of humanity, morphed by Nen, unfit to live in the V5 countries, but not strong enough to live on the Dark Continent. And thus they were left behind on the outskirts of Lake Mobius to make sure that humanity would never return to the Dark Continent, and that if they did, they would only send their strongest. But who knows? These are just a couple of the thousands of questions that we're left with in the wake of an unending hiatus. Is humanity from the Dark Continent? Were they forced to leave it because of their overusage of Nen? Are the Gatekeepers a missing link between the newest version of humanity and the version of humanity that lived on the Dark Continent? Is Don Freaks trying to repopulate the Dark Continent with humanity once again? Or is Don Freaks simply trying to document humanity's departure from this landmass? Will humanity be able to return to the Dark Continent to live there for a significant amount of time one day? And will we ever see all the freaks come together on the Dark Continent once again as a family? We don't know, which is why I'm sitting here in my chair begging you, Togashi, please, just write a web novel. Just do what I'm doing. Just sit here and clickety-clack on the keyboard for a couple of days. Hell, you could release it as a series of tweets. I do not mind. Just finish the story. I don't need the pictures. I just want to know what happens. And here's a crazy thought. Have somebody else draw the pictures. Or you draw a little stick figure with pointy hair. That's Gon. And then you draw a little other stick figure with a star on their face. That's Hisoka. And then you draw these little stick figures into panels that you designate, and you put the text above them. And then you have somebody else draw that. Because, well, I love your art style. I really do. It's not like mind-blowingly good. Like if the art style switched up a little bit, nobody would be like,
oh no, Togashi's late 90s art style has been changed.
Because I guarantee you, no one is reading Hunter x Hunter for the art. Better yet, just forward me the ending. I'll fill in the gaps. I will quit YouTube tomorrow if it means I get to finish Hunter x Hunter. I would go back into science after not being in it for 3 years and be like, hey, sorry, I was following my dreams. Can you let me back in if it meant I got to finish this story? What do you guys think? Do you think humanity was on the Dark Continent and then they had to leave because of Nen? I don't know. Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Please, man.